The subcommittee will come to order. Our first panel will have just one witness, Dr. Janet Woodcock, the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. We're happy to have you with us today, Dr. Woodcock, and your written testimony will be made part of the record, and you're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'd really like to thank you for the opportunity to testify about 3 important issues: the United States generic drug program and user fees that would support it, the new biosimilars program and proposed user fee, and the ongoing crisis of shortage of essential drugs in the United States. I'm joined today by Dr. Teresa Mullen on my right, who is the director of the Office of Planning and Informatics at the Center for Drugs. Dr. Mullen was the lead negotiator on the prescription drug user fee program and on the biosimilars program. And to my left is Mr. Peter Beckerman, who is a senior advisor for policy in the Office of Policy at FDA. And he was one of the lead negotiators on the generic drug user fee program. Since enacted by Congress in 1984, the current generic drug program has been a stunning success by most accounts. Today, over 3/4 of prescriptions dispensed are for high-quality, affordable generics, as the members have said, saving Americans billions of dollars, literally. But this program has been the victim of its unprecedented success. Applications to the program have skyrocketed, and the program has not been able to keep up. Times to approval have lengthened and are prolonged, and over 2,000 applications are in a so-called backlog at the Office of Generic Drugs. At the same time, globalization of the industry has challenged FDA to assure the same level of inspectional coverage that is carried out domestically for the foreign facilities. The new user fee program proposed to Congress addresses both these problems head-on. The program would bring timelines and predictability to the review process, eliminate the backlogs. It would also provide a level playing field for inspections to ensure that the same quality standards are maintained wherever in the world the generic drug is made. These changes will ensure that U.S. consumers continue to have access to safe, effective, high-quality, and affordable generic drugs. The proposed biosimilar user fee program is intended to support a new emerging industry. Biologics drugs developed over the past 20 years have provided new and effective treatment options for patients with serious diseases, such as rheumatoid arthritis and cancer. But the generic drug program that existed did not apply to and was not really appropriate for these complex biological molecules. In 2007, Congress created a new pathway for biosimilar biologics and instructed FDA to develop a user fee proposal, which we have done. This program is intended to support an emerging industry, and I'll be very pleased to be able to discuss it. I would like to thank the members for Mr. Murphy and Mr. Pitts and the additional members for introducing legislation. We're really happy to hear that there's bipartisan support, and we look forward to working with you. I'm also pleased to announce that later today, FDA will introduce 3 draft guidances for industry on biosimilars. These will contain technical information that will help the industry as they develop these new products for the U.S. market. The third topic, drug shortages, is a very important issue. Millions of Americans rely on medicines to support or sustain their health, as we heard from Dr. Burgess. The recent shortages of sterile and injectable drugs, many of which are essential in cancer treatment or in seriously ill patients, have brought a spotlight on this problem. The causes of drug shortage are multifactorial, but in this case, a perfect storm came together to create the current situation of shortages. FDA does everything possible to both prevent and ameliorate shortages, including stimulating the production of other manufacturers, allowing risk mitigation strategies for products that have manufacturing difficulties, moving up the queue of applications so we could get additional products onto the market to alleviate shortages, and even arranging for temporary importation of similar products from other countries. For the current shortages, this has not been enough, and hospitals and clinicians are facing and have been facing significant shortages. We look forward with working with you to ensure that Americans have continued, uninterrupted access to effective, safe, high-quality, and affordable drugs to sustain their health. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. And now begins the questioning, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Woodcock, how many applications are in the generic backlog at FDA?
We count what you might consider a backlog to have about 2,000 applications.
2,000.
That includes some drugs that couldn't be approved now because the patents haven't expired on the innovators. You can send in your application beforehand, and then you have to wait. But there are many in that backlog that could be approved if we had time to get to them or had the inspectional resources to do the inspection.
And how will the generic drug user fee agreement help clear out this backlog?
The agreement has several parts, and one is specifically directed at the backlog. What we have recommended to Congress is that there be a one-time backlog fee paid at the start of the program of $50 million. That would go toward us beginning to work on the backlog. One of the goals of the program that we'd be held to is clearing up the backlog by the end of the 5-year user fee program. So by that time, we would be in steady state. Applications in the door, applications out the door, with predictability, that process and timelines. So we would expect with the backlog fee and our commitments and timelines that the backlog would be eliminated.
Can you be a little more specific on what kind of generic drug applications are in this backlog, and how will clearing this backlog save patients in our healthcare system money?
Most of the drugs in the backlog are additional copies of a drug where there is already a generic, because we expedite the first generic out the door to try and get patients that initial savings. But so that additional copies of a generic will have been shown to further lower the cost of the drug, the price, due to competition. So this is important for lower cost drugs and also to have a robust supply. I think we're learning, and we know from the shortage situation, it's important to have multiple manufacturers of important drugs.
Now, in your testimony, you talk about FDA's efforts to expedite review of manufacturer submissions to help alleviate drug shortages, and currently it takes FDA 31 months to review these submissions. Can you give us more background on what expedite means? On average, how long does it take to expedite those submissions that can help alleviate drug shortages?
I can't give you an exact number, but what we did, we have a queue, and so everything is waiting, and usually generic drugs are reviewed first in, they're reviewed first. So if you're the third in, you're reviewed third, and so forth, because for fairness purposes. What we do, if there's a shortage drug where that application might help ameliorate the shortage, we pull it out of the queue and review it as quickly as possible. So much of that 30 months can be gone. If the application is good, we can review that rapidly and get that drug on the market. So we have very few drugs waiting in the queue that actually would address shortages. We have identified any of those drugs, and we've expedited review of the applications.
Now, how will the Biosimilars user fee program provide predictability and consistency regarding the review of biosimilars applications, and how will the Biosimilars user fee program help this burgeoning industry?
The biosimilars user fee program will provide predictability of timelines and review and process to this industry, similar to what the prescription drug user fee does for innovator products. To some extent, the biosimilars program was modeled on the PDUFA program. However, it has a development piece in it to recognize the emerging nature of this industry. And that development piece, they pay fees and they get a series of development meetings so we can give them extensive advice on how to develop their products. And then when the final application comes in, there are timelines and goals associated with those timelines. So FDA, in exchange for having this user fee program, will be expected to meet those timeliness goals on review.
All right, thank you. My time has expired. I'll recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Flynn, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, we've heard these statistics about the drug production overseas, that 40% of drugs and 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients come from abroad. That's my concern. As you know, Mr. Dingle, Ms. DeGette, myself, and Mr. Waxman have introduced the Drug Safety Enhancement Act that gives the FDA authorities and resources to address the problem of these ingredients and drugs from overseas. You mentioned in your testimony the challenge represented by foreign inspections. My understanding is that current law requires FDA to inspect domestic drug facilities every 2 years, but is silent with respect to foreign facilities. That seems to be an even playing field, obviously. And I know resources are always going to be an issue, but I still think that the bifurcation doesn't make sense. So I wanted, assuming you have unlimited resources, which of course is absurd, but assuming you have unlimited resources, do you agree that inspecting foreign and domestic facilities at the same frequency would make sense?
Yes, I believe that what we need to do is a risk-based approach, and if some facilities in the United States and some facilities overseas may need very close FDA supervision because of problems they're having. Other facilities may be on a different schedule based on the risks that they pose. But
they're not based on whether they're domestic versus overseas.
That is exactly right.
Now, would you need new authority to permit you to do that, which, to make sure that it's not different, foreign versus domestic, and to do the risk assessment? Would you need new authority for that?
We primarily lack the resources to perform this inspectional program, and one of the principal goals of the new generic drug user fee program is to level that playing field of inspection. And one of the proposals there is that we conduct risk-based surveillance inspections around the world and achieve parity or a level playing field.
So it's more a question of the resources than new authority then?
Yes, I believe that, of course, the law sort of sends a message that you're supposed to do the domestic every 2 years and is silent on the foreign. But from what we are doing, we're trying to ensure the quality of drugs for our patients, and where the drug is produced should not be taken into account.
Oh, thank you. Now, would it be helpful to have additional resources to conduct more foreign inspections of brand facilities? I mean, this isn't confined to just generic, correct?
We need to inspect all facilities producing drugs of any kind, including over-the-counter drugs and so on, at the appropriate intensity for the risk that they bear.
Okay. Now, what about the responsibility of U.S. companies? For example, we had the heparin situation illustrated the importance of raising expectations of pharmaceutical companies to be familiar with their own suppliers, coming from abroad. Do you think that U.S. companies should have to be able to ensure that the products they sell meet U.S. requirements, even though those ingredients are coming from abroad? Is there any new authorities that would help the FDA in making sure that companies meet those responsibilities?
Yes, as we have said repeatedly, we feel that our authorities at the border in particular are somewhat limited, and there are additional authorities that have been discussed that would aid in keeping foreign products that don't meet our standards out of this country.
All right, let me just ask, I have a minute left, with regard to BASUFA and the BSUFA negotiations, both you and the FDA Commissioner Hamburg gave assurances to the generic industry that the biosimilar user fee program would receive $20 million in funding. Now, I understand we're talking about, money that would be shifted around within the agency. What steps are being taken to make sure that happens?
Well, we have made a commitment. Dr. Mullen, who's here, we've been just discussing our time reporting and other tracking mechanisms. We keep very close track of how we expend both our BA money and our user fee money.
But I mean, is this something that you're going to move around within the agency? Is it going to be in the budget, or is it a new $20 million that we have to come up with? I assumed it was within the agency. That's what I'm trying to find out.
Of course, we would appreciate, having resources to conduct this program. However, we do have $1.8 million right now in appropriated dollars for the biosimilars program, and we would make up the money. If we don't receive appropriated money, we would use BA funds that are existing within the Center for Drugs.
All right, thank you so much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Murphy, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Doctor, for being here. Appreciate your candid and informed comments on this. Let me start off by asking about I want to make sure I understand the FDA rules with regard to these medications. The Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act assumes that a drug is adulterated unless the methods used for manufacturing of drug products conform to good manufacturing practice. Am I right that it works under that assumption?
That's correct.
Can you explain the role and importance of these good manufacturing practices in terms of helping to ensure the safety and integrity of FDA-approved products? Can you explain how that works?
Certainly. When drugs are produced in mass production in a factory, all right, there are many procedures. The modern term would be quality management, okay, to make sure that each time the drug is produced adequately and of adequate quality, and that no errors have occurred. And it would be amazing if you go in a factory, and as we do all the time, to see how many times something can go wrong. And so you must check, and you must observe, and you must test, and you must improve, and do all that. And those are embodied in regulations called the Current Good Manufacturing Practices Regulations. And we also have international agreements on a lot of this, how it should look, that we've worked out through the International Conference on Harmonization.
So as you, so the assumption is unless you've actually seen what they do and given your seal of approval to that, we're assuming it has not met that standard. Is that a fair statement?
Well, we have set standards for what the quality management should be like, and also we review the drug, make sure the testing and so forth will control the drug adequately, but until we go in there, we don't know if they're actually following those procedures. And they may follow them at one time and then later slip from that and get into problems and not produce a quality drug.
Hence the importance of inspecting plants on a regular or tighter basis, and as you sometimes do, a surprise visit may occur and then you short period and show up again. I know we've had hearings in the past where there's no such thing as a surprise visit to a foreign country. They know you're coming. That's and where correct. You're going. So do these practices differ in the United States versus other countries then in terms of what how medications are manufactured?
I mean, by the manufacturers
yes,
themselves?
By the manufacturers themselves.
No, well, there is a wide range of capacity and functionality in the different countries, all right? In the United States, there's been a long history of FDA inspections and understanding of what the standards are. Nevertheless, I will point out, over the past year or so, we've had multiple recalls, and some of the drug shortage problems are due to U.S. manufacturers who are not being able to manufacture their product. So it requires vigilance and continued attention to be able to manufacture these products right. That said, in other parts of the world, it's much more uneven. They may have extremely modern factories and be right on top of their game, and there are many factories that may be substandard in different areas.
Given all that, what's preventing the FDA from updating good manufacturing practices right now that require companies to verify their suppliers are complying? And associated with that, do you think the bills before us here sufficiently address your concerns? And either way, will you be able to offer other recommendations for cleaning up these bills if you feel that's necessary?
Yeah, well, we would be happy to work with you. I believe that the user fee bills are not around policy or regulation. They are about providing extra resources to perform activities. The regulations or law around drug safety and quality have not been really modified for a long time and are probably not totally congruent with modern understanding. So there has been discussion by this committee and others about are there additional standards that could be put into place that would bolster and bring these up to modern understanding of what is needed. For example, I'm always surprised, and I'm sure most Americans would be, to hear that we can't really, there's a presumption that anything that's being imported into our country of a drug is okay, and we have to prove that there's something wrong with it rather than the opposite. Most other countries, that's not the case.
I want to make sure I hear what you're saying. You're saying you have to prove something's wrong with the imported drug? So what you told me before is with companies here, there's an assumption that it's adulterated unless they can prove they've gone through inspections. But you're saying when a foreign drug comes over, the assumption is everything is fine unless you prove otherwise?
Yes.
That's two different standards.
Now, I'm not a lawyer, all right, and so, but that's how I understand the legal framework is set up. So we have to look at that and prove some way that it is not adequate for entry into the United States.
I appreciate it. I think that would come as a shock to most Americans to understand that that's how things are going. Thank you so much.
And I will tell you that's not the case in other countries where they can hold things at the border if they even feel that they may not meet the standard.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, gentleman, and recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dengel, for 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. Welcome, Dr. Woodcock. I am sponsor of H.R. 1483, which I hope this committee will give some strong consideration to. My questions today are going to require only yes or no answers in view of the fact I have so many. Starting, over 70% of prescriptions filled today are for generic drugs, considering the fact that 40% of all drugs come from overseas and 80% of active pharmaceutical agreements are also from overseas. It's critical that we be able to protect American consumers by ensuring the safety of the drug supply chain. In order to do this, FDA must clearly have the proper authorities in place. Dr. Woodcock, yes or no, if you please. Does the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act require FDA to complete GMP inspections of domestic drug manufacturers every 2 years? Yes or no?
Yes.
Does the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act require FDA to complete GMP inspections of foreign drug manufacturers on a comparable basis? Yes or no?
No.
Would you have the resources to do it if they did?
Not currently.
Is it accurate to say that current law is silent on the frequency with which FDA must inspect foreign facilities? Yes or no?
Yes.
Does FDA generally meet the biennial inspection requirement for domestic drug facilities currently? Yes or no?
Yes.
Is it true that FDA does not inspect foreign facilities at the same frequency as domestic facilities? Yes or no?
Yes.
Is it true that a lack of financial and personal resources are contributing to factors not for inspecting foreign drug facilities more frequently? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, could you repeat
I'll give
that
it again.
a little more slowly?
Is it true that a lack of financial and personal resources are contributing factors to not inspecting foreign drug facilities more frequently?
Yes.
Yes or no? Do you agree that conducting inspections of domestic and foreign drug facilities at comparable frequency is as important to ensuring a level playing field for drug manufacturers? Yes or no?
Yes.
Sometimes the playing field gets slanted against United States manufacturers because of our inability to inspect foreign manufacturers and suppliers of different kinds. Isn't that so?
Yes.
Can our goal be achieved by using risk-based inspection systems?
Yes.
Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you agree that a risk-based inspection schedule for domestic and foreign drug facilities based, for example, on compliance history, time since last inspection, volume, and type of product would allow FDA to better target their resources? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you agree that conducting comparable inspections of domestic and foreign facilities is important to public health? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you agree that FDA needs adequate resources, both financial and personnel, to conduct comparable inspections of domestic and foreign drug manufacturers? Yes or no?
Yes.
Does the prescription drug user fee agreement currently provide resources for pre-approval inspection? Yes or no?
Yes.
Does the prescription drug user fee agreement currently provide resources for any inspections beyond pre-approval inspection? Yes or no?
No.
Do you know that, as you know, the generic drug user fee agreement provides additional resources for FDA to conduct GMP inspections of both domestic and foreign drug facilities? Does FDA need similar resources for inspections of facilities manufacturing innovator drugs? Yes or no?
Yes, we need similar resources.
Now, one obstacle for ensuring comparable inspections of domestic and foreign facilities is a lack of complete and accurate information that FDA has on generic drug manufacturing establishments. Will the Generic Drug User Fee Act help FDA to identify all domestic and foreign drug and active pharmaceutical ingredient facilities involved in the making of generic drugs through registration? Yes or no?
Yes, as proposed.
And I'm assuming that that is a very badly needed authority at Food and Drug. Is that yes or no?
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I have completed my business, and with 9 seconds to spare, I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman for his gracious.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the record will include an analysis of H.R. 1483, the Drug Safety Enforcement Act of 2011, of which I am sponsor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. And now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And again, Dr. Woodcock, welcome to our humble little hearing room here at the Energy and Commerce Committee. We welcome you back. Let me ask you a couple of questions that deal with the issue of conflicts and the exclusion of people from the FDA advisory panels because of conflicts of interest. Have there been instances where experts have been disqualified from serving on advisory committees because they served as an investigator for the product under consideration?
Yes.
Have there ever been instances where someone is disqualified because they've been in a clinical trial and as an investigator for an unrelated product?
Yes.
So I think I have an accurate quote from you where you say it is difficult finding highly experienced people who do not have conflicts.
That's correct.
And we have delays in the panels because of this policy. And in fact, your Commissioner, Margaret Hamburg, Dr. Hamburg, has said some meetings require expertise that is limited to a handful of experts who can often have conflicts of interest. So tell us what the real-world consequences of this are. Most of us have never been in an FDA advisory panel meeting. So what are the implications of having people that have to exclude themselves or be excluded because they either have knowledge of the product under consideration or they've been involved in an unrelated investigation?
We are asking the committee for advice on very complicated scientific questions. Our scientists are very well versed on the topic and will have gone over all the information in the application and any related literature. So they really want people at the table who can help them grapple with these complex questions. And they would really like experts, trialists, or disease experts who can shed additional light on the problem they're trying to deal with.
Just as someone from the outside, is the converse of that universe also true, that the people who are involved may not have the knowledge set or skills to make some of the decisions they're required to make, and in some cases maybe even lack the basic fund of knowledge to deal with the clinical question at hand?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for that succinct and concise answer. Let me ask you this, since you've given me the benefit of some time. I have been in a ping pong match for the last couple of weeks, couple of months, since the 1st of January, when the EPA banned the sale of over-the-counter asthma inhalers. I'm an asthma patient myself, and I will just tell you, all across this country, people are going to be going to the CVS pharmacy at midnight because they've had an asthma attack and they are out of all of their other options, and they're used to being able to buy for $16 Primatene inhaler, and now they cannot. And we, as members of Congress, are going to start hearing about that. It's not going to happen all at once, but it is slowly going to start rolling out into the American landscape, such that by the time of the August recess, I suspect there will be a number of people who show up in each member's town halls complaining about this policy. So now we've heard from the EPA, and the EPA says it's your fault, and Commissioner Hamburg said, no, it's the EPA. Can you help us? Primatene has been on the market for a long time, and the only thing that has changed is the propellant. CFC changed to HFA. I would argue that HFA is not as efficient a dispersant as CFC, but that being aside, there really is no difference in the active pharmaceutical ingredient in the over-the-counter inhaler Primatene, but for whatever reason, it's held up somewhere. Can you help us get that done?
The switching of all the asthma inhalers was triggered by the Montreal Protocol that was agreed to by the United States to eliminate CFCs to help with the problem with the ozone layer. And FDA has gone through a very long process to inform the manufacturers, work with the community, prepare them, and then execute the switches. For the prescription albuterol inhalers, which are really the preferred standard of care, as you know, for asthma.
Yeah, but all of us don't plan ahead.
Right.
And I know I'm the world's worst asthma patient, and I will forget. And then something happens that triggers an attack at 2 o'clock in the morning. And now the only option is to go to the emergency room and get a treatment, and that's $1,500.
I understand.
It was $16, $16.00 before, and this is what we've visited upon people. Well, I do want to enlist your aid in getting this problem solved. I've asked the EPA to allow the sale of existing Primatene inhalers with CFC until those markets are exhausted, but we really do have to fix it. That's why we have an approval rating of 8%, because people look at this and say, well, this is a simple problem. The stuff was for sale before, it's got a different propellant, sell it again. Or did you really think that asthma patients were blowing a hole in the ozone layer? I don't think so, and you'll never convince me otherwise. But my time has expired, and I'm going to yield to, who am I going to yield to? No one on your side. I'll yield to Dr. Gingrey. Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay, Dr. Gingrey, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions, sir.
I just want to welcome Dr. Woodcock. Thank you. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Woodcock, much has been made over the past months and years about drug and medical production moving overseas to countries like China, and many reasons for this migration have been put forward. In a study that ran in Health Affairs, this was November 2011, entitled Evolving Brand Name and Generic Drug Competition May Warrant a Revision of the Hatch-Waxman Act. The authors state that, and I quote, the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984 raises questions about whether the Act's intended balance of incentives for cost savings and continued innovation has been achieved. Generic drug usage and challenges to brand name drugs patents have increased markedly, resulting in greatly increased cost savings, but also potentially reduced incentives for innovators, new drug applications, brand name. Congress should review whether Hatch-Waxman is achieving its intended purpose of balancing incentives for generics and innovation. It also should consider whether the law should be amended so that some of its provisions are brought more in line with recently enacted legislation governing approval of so-called biosimilars. Dr. Woodcock, do you believe that Congress should review the current Hatch-Waxman paradigm to ensure that the intended balance of incentives for cost savings and innovation continues to have been achieved?
I would say that deciding on those trade-offs between innovation and cost saving for the American public is one of the jobs of Congress. and FDA will execute the provisions as they are laid out by the Congress. It is clear that there have been tremendous cost savings, as many of the members have indicated, from the generics program. We also know that the innovator industry is struggling right now. That, again, is multifactorial and would have to be the subject of a different discussion. But the innovator industry overall is in a crisis. Despite that, they have put forth many innovative drugs, which we have been able to approve over the past year. We approved 30 new molecular entities last year, many of them very innovative drugs. So whether that's the correct balance, I think, is a very complicated economic issue that I'm not able to opine on, and it involves many societal trade-offs to decide.
Well, I thank you, and I know you can't state exactly, but your answer certainly suggests that you have some concerns that maybe the balance that we are trying to achieve is not there. Is that a fair statement? Or
I think many of us are concerned about the health of the innovator industry, which is what brings new products and treatments and cures to people who lack therapies right now. However, whether or not Hatch-Waxman is the way to deal with that is beyond my purview.
Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. I want to commend the FDA on its concern for U.S. patients in light of our current drug shortage crisis. As you know, this is an issue that's important to this committee and this Congress, and I want to commend my colleague, Representative DeGette, for her leadership in this area. As a medical provider, I believe that proper notification can play a critical role in ensuring patients get the best care possible, especially those with life-threatening conditions such as cancer. In your testimony, you state that, quote, although many of the root causes of drug shortages are beyond our control, we are committed to addressing this important issue and look forward to working with the subcommittee on this issue. Tell me, Dr. Woodcock, what are the root causes of drug shortages and which ones are beyond our control?
Well, I would refer you to the excellent document that was written by at HHS, the Assistant Secretary for Planning Evaluation, I believe, at HHS, that discussed this, because many of them are economic issues. What we saw with the sterile injectables, which are the drugs that are in great shortage right now, was a surge in capacity over the past 10 years, but with a very limited number of manufacturers, most of whom are in the United States. Yeah. And with that capacity surge, they took on a large inventory of sterile injectables that they were producing, each of these manufacturers. And then when they developed problems in their manufacturing ability, where they were getting particulates or endotoxin or other potential bacterial contamination and so forth, which I will add, these things are hard to avoid, and they take a lot of diligence to keep sterile manufacturing at a high quality level. But when they encountered these problems, then we lapsed into a shortage situation with few alternatives, or maybe no alternatives.
I see my time has expired, and as I yield back, would you be sure and get that report to me? I would appreciate it very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. The chair now recognizes Mr. Towns of New York for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning the witness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Dr. Woodcock, I'm concerned about the large backlog of generic drug applications. What can be done about that?
Well, I'm concerned about it too, and the proposal that we've given to Congress for the generic drug user fee program has a specific provision to eliminate the backlog over the first course of that program.
Right. Is there cooperation across the board, in terms of the pharmaceutical companies and all that? Everybody's on board with this agreement?
Yes, I think it's in everyone's best interest to eliminate this backlog and to have a predictable and efficient generic drug process.
Right. Once this goes into place, what will the turnaround time be, approximately?
The goal time for any generic drug application is a first review, a complete response within 10 months of the submission of the application.
Right.
so that the goal would be every generic drug applicant would get an answer back in 10 months. And we would then look at how many of those could get right on the market or what were the problems that would keep them going into another cycle.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to do something we don't do around here. I'm going to yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman's generosity and recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for questions.
I thank the chairman and Dr. Woodcock. Thanks very much for being with us today. I'd like to kind of go back to what Dr. Gingrey was talking about at the very end in regards to drug shortages. And I've been working with several other members in the past few months on this issue. And first of all, if you said in your opening statement that, especially on drug shortages, that we had a perfect storm. Could you describe what that perfect storm is or was?
Well, it was the enhanced utilization of the older sterile injectable drugs, okay? So the demand went up for them. At the same time, new sterile injectable drugs went generic. And so then firms took those on as well. So then the demand on their lines, they have a limited number of manufacturing lines that can make sterile injectables, all right? Because it's very hard to do that. So the demand went up both for the existing drugs and the new generic drugs that were sterile injectables. At the same time, it takes a while to expand the capacity and bring up new facilities. So that did not happen. And then manufacturing problems occurred within many of those lines, thus in making them have perhaps to shut down the line and precipitate a sudden shortage. The other manufacturers who might take up the slack were also having capacity problems of their own or having manufacturing problems. So all these factors came together to create really an unprecedented amount of shortages that we're trying to deal with, and shortages of drugs that Americans cannot do without.
Let me ask then, over the past year, what have you all done to alleviate that problem?
In 2011, we alleviated, we think about, 175? Yeah, 175 drug shortages were alleviated by our actions. Now, 86 of those, I think, were from one firm where we were able to do interventions. But we have multiple interventions, as I described, that we can alleviate those. Nevertheless, there's several hundred shortages that are ongoing.
Are there additional items that you can do then?
Pardon me?
Are there additional items that you could work on to help on that issue?
Yes. Well, since the executive order by the president that asked firms to notify us of any kind of shortage, and we have also put in a database that we are tracking these very carefully. We've added staff to the drug shortage program that we have at FDA, but we do feel that if there were legislation that requested companies or required companies to notify us, that would help us in perhaps averting more shortages.
And also, is there a disease area where there are more significant drug shortages than others?
Right now, we're hearing from the cancer community, and that's because many of the cancer drugs are injectables. But the injectable drug shortage affects many other kinds of disease areas. And over the years, historically, you couldn't predict where the shortages would arise. They have been in all sorts of disease areas.
And also, will the generic drug user fee help with the drug shortage issue, do you believe?
I believe that having a robust industry that has predictable timelines for its applications and can get applications through, and also having an inspectional force that we can get out there quickly and do the inspections in the appropriate time will help with shortages, because one of the things we need for shortages is we need more than one manufacturer that's able to make that drug. So if something happens at one plant, then there's somebody else who can ramp up production.
Okay. And some of the committee hearings and the press have suggested that the key characteristics of the drugs in shortage, older physician-administered drugs, underscore a failure in the older generic market, and that incentives in this market are critical to solving the crisis. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'm sorry, could you
Yeah.
repeat that?
Yeah, there's been some in the committee hearings and also out in the press have suggested that the key characteristics of drugs in shortage, older physician-administered drugs, underscore a failure in the older generic market, and that incentives in this market are critical to solving that crisis. And do you agree with that assessment?
I am not qualified to make a judgment on that. Being a physician and not an economist, the HHS report felt that it was a multiple number of factors, and it wasn't simply an incentives problem. But Teresa, do you have?
Yeah, I think that report would probably provide the best description of all the kinds of factors. A number of them are economic, and factors that are not within our ability to control. And if there may be other ways to address those, but we have limited ability to address those factors.
Okay.
No ability in some cases.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank the chairman for recognizing me, and Dr. Woodcock, thank you for your testimony today. I'm actually going to just make a statement to add on to the list of reasons why the topic at hand, the drug shortages, is a very real issue. I would ask a question following, but it's already been asked, and you've supplied the answer that I know you would answer to me. But it is such a prevalent problem, plaguing manufacturers, hospitals, doctors, and patients alike. So this is a story of one of my constituents who reached out to our office. She's a pharmacy buyer at a nonprofit organization in my district which works with cancer patients. So right now our organization is not able to purchase life-saving critical care drugs, and for some of them they've been waiting more than 4 months. I know this isn't a new story to you either, but it's one more story. And the only route available for this organization, because they're nonprofit, is to get these drugs from the black market, who is essentially auction them off, often charging 3 times more than what they ought to cost. As a nonprofit, you can imagine they never are successful in their bids, and instead the treatments for their patients they're representing are delayed. This is hard to believe in this country at this moment. So let me turn to something a little different.
May I say something
Of
about
course,
that?
please.
Yeah, we are accepting reports from outside parties where they have encountered excessive pricing behavior and other behaviors that we can refer to the Department of Justice.
I appreciate that, and actually we'll take that back to this constituent and to others. We'll let our district offices know when they hear these stories. There is a path that can be followed. You don't just have to say, I'm so sorry. We can say, well, there is a path, and there could be some recompense that is made in that area. Another mechanism for helping to address drug shortages is notifying of the FDA of impending shortages. I know that in the next panel, you're going to hear testimony discussing the Accelerated Recovery Initiative that the industry is putting forward to help address and prevent shortage. Anticipating that might come up in their discussion, what do you think of this proposal? And in particular, do you think it should be implemented? In what ways would it obviate the need for legislation? I mean, how is this going to help us, and so we can focus on things that would make a difference for you, and that they are going to come up with this solution?
Yeah, we haven't had the opportunity to examine the proposal in detail, and we look forward to working with the industry on the proposal as well as with Congress.
Okay, so you're going to be listening carefully to the next panel as well. And then finally, with the rest of my time, we've heard a lot of discussion today about the increasingly globalized drug supply chain and the challenges it poses. I want to ask you about a couple of problems I've heard about in particular. First, I understand the FDA has had problems conducting or completing inspections of facilities overseas or abroad. Would you be willing to describe some of these problems, such as if a foreign manufacturer doesn't allow you in to inspect its plant or unduly delays you from performing an inspection? What recourse do you now have, and what additional authority would be helpful?
Peter, would you like to? Mr. Beckerman will address.
All right.
Sure. Currently, FDA has to show that a drug appears to be adulterated or misbranded to keep it out of the country. And if FDA inspectors are delayed, limited, or denied in an inspection, there's no immediate recourse that the agency can take. And so having an explicit authority to allow us to exclude a drug if our inspectors have been impeded would be extremely helpful.
So these companies know very well that if they delay or deny, that nothing's going to happen anyway.
There are very different incentives depending on the type of inspection that's being done. Firms have an obvious incentive to let FDA investigators in for a pre-approval inspection because that's a condition precedent to getting their drug on the market. Once a drug is on the market, that incentive no longer exists, and it would be helpful for FDA to have a tool.
So having a tool would be useful to you.
That's right.
To note. I also understand that information sharing with foreign regulatory partners has posed some challenges. Could you describe a couple of these challenges? There's a few more seconds left. And also the role of importers in the supply chain that has become a more prominent one in recent years.
On the information sharing question, in particular, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a provision that prevents FDA from sharing what's called trade secret information. And this is not typically the sort of thing that we think about as the secret formula for Coke, but it's information related to the manufacturing process. It's critical to be able to share that information with regulatory partners if we want to take advantage of their regulatory reach and be as efficient as possible. So addressing the inability to share that sort of information would be very helpful.
Would that require legislation?
It would.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair thanks gentlelady and recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. I'm always impressed how well you answer questions. The gray market. I'm speaking, of course, about drug shortages. What is the volume of drug on the if 5FU is in a shortage, do we have a sense of how much the gray market will arise to fill that need?
Well, I would ask Captain Valerie Jensen, who's our head of drug shortages, to see if you have any insight into that.
Yes, I'm Val Jensen, Associate Director of Drug Shortage Program. And we don't think there's a large supply in the gray market from what we understand about the gray market. FDA doesn't receive a lot of information about the gray market, but we do know that from what we hear, it's a very small volume that's in the gray market right now.
But I'm concerned, in this report, the HHS, they speak about if there's early notification of shortages, there may be hoarding. That almost seems like you're throwing gasoline upon the potential of a gray market.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
We would agree with that.
And so is it good to have early notification or not?
What we would do, so if we receive the early notification, what we do with that is try to work with the company, whatever company is having the problem, on addressing that issue as soon as possible. Hopefully we can prevent the shortage before it even occurs. That's our goal.
Now I'm also concerned, I don't know this, I'm just asking, do some people make it a practice to hoard in anticipation and therefore step in? It clearly would be a nice way to make some money. You mentioned there could be a referral to DOJ, but this is kind of a late development. Have people done that in the past? Have we looked at the ordering patterns of companies? Do they order here, then they suddenly order there, sort of thing?
FDA doesn't normally get that type of information, the ordering information.
Would that be HRSA?
The manufacturers would know what's being ordered. When there's a potential shortage, sometimes companies do.
But let me ask, because I think here last time, and people have mentioned they don't know the source of drugs on the gray market. It seems logical to look at, wait, who's ordering? Is there a difference in ordering pattern relative to a particular entity's patient base? Does that make sense? Now, that just occurs to me, and frankly, I've looked at that, and when you look at that, you think, that's kind of interesting. Small little hospital ordering a lot of drug. Mm-hmm. Now, has anybody pursued that more than just kind of looking at it?
Yeah, it's just not data that FDA has access to as far as hospital ordering patterns.
I could give it to you. I mean, I just made a phone call and got it, and actually it kind of raises questions, frankly.
Right. Well, I think those are the types of things that law enforcement might be interested in. Okay. Also, I would say if we have a early notification process, we would not plan to make it public unless we had failed to avert the shortage, and the shortage was imminent.
Now, okay, then last time, and again, as you were describing the means by which you averted shortage, there seems to be somewhat of an ad hoc basis to it. You got a call, you rushed in, you started making it. In my life, I've learned that it's better to have a system as opposed to an ad hoc. Have you systematized that, or is it still somewhat ad hoc?
I think we've systematized it to the extent it is possible. The problem is that the manufacturers cannot predict when they're going to run into shortage. Many of these shortages are precipitated by manufacturing failures. They make the drug, they're going along making the drug, everything's fine, and then they discover particulates, they've mixed up the drugs.
But presumably there's quality control that on a regular basis they're going to pull up and say, okay, every 6 weeks we're going to run a sample and make sure it doesn't have sporicide or something in it.
Well, it's much more than that, actually. There's a very tight system of controls. You were talking about the good manufacturing practices call for very tight controls.
Now, I have 53 seconds. Can I just, by the way, just to go back, if you don't have access to the ordering pattern of the hospitals, who does have that data?
Do you know who?
Yeah, I think we'd have to look into that.
Could you let me know that? I'd be really interested in that. Let me ask one more thing. Going back, Mr. Dingle had a line of questions about whether or not you need more resources. I think it was our previous conversation. You mentioned that union contracts would limit the ability to send people overseas. Dr. Hamburg was here, and she really kind of rope-a-doped me on that. So let me just ask a yes or no. Do you have the ability under your union contract to send somebody overseas to inspect a plant if they otherwise object? Yes or no?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't supervise the field staff, and I imagine it depends on the circumstances. So I can get back to you, but I can't answer that straight out.
Does anybody at the panel know that? Okay, if you could, I'd appreciate that.
Certainly.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. That concludes the members of subcommittee questioning. That objection will go to the members of the full committee, and Ms. DeGette of Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to ask a follow-up question about the drug shortages, and I appreciate my colleagues on both sides of the aisle working with me on this issue, because it's something that sort of hit and escalated, and we're all hearing about it from our hospitals. We're all concerned about the stories we hear, particularly with these generic injectables, about the shortages that hospitals are having. A lot of them are pediatric cancer patients and other patients like that. But I'm hearing from my pharmacists at the hospital that this is now expanding to many other drugs. They told me that they have a drug shortage a day at some of these hospitals, some place where they're trying to make these value judgments about what they treat the patients with. And so I also am concerned about the hoarding issues and the other issues. But I guess I would ask you, either any of the witnesses, to talk about, under the current voluntary program that you have, do you see a lot of problem with hoarding right now?
Hoarding.
What we receive, we do receive reports from pharmacists, mostly faxes and emails that they've received from gray marketers, from companies advertising these drugs at very high prices. And we do forward all of those reports to the Department of Justice.
And have you seen a large incidence of that?
We have, over the past year
and
a half.
And
yes.
do you think there's some ways we can write legislation so we don't experience a lot of hoarding if we make a mandatory reporting program?
What we see, so with notifications, with mandatory reporting, we would not post a shortage until we know that shortage is going to occur, absolutely going to occur, or has already occurred. We would want to hold off, because our goal is to try to prevent all shortages. If we can do that through working with the manufacturers, through working with alternate manufacturers to ramp up, as well as sometimes having to temporarily import product, that's what we're doing.
So your process would be, if you got notification of a shortage, to contact the manufacturers to see if it could be resolved internally.
Absolutely.
Before it's a little bit of a weighing game, isn't it? Because if you don't notify the hospitals and the physicians quickly enough, then having any kind of a notification system is pointless, right? So you're
Right.
going to have to figure out how to do that.
We need a good way to get information out when we know there's going to be a shortage, get it out as quickly as possible so that hospitals can make decisions.
And what would happen if you did have a system where you could get that notification out? What would the hospitals then do with that information?
Well, they could plan accordingly. Sometimes treatments can be reserved for certain types of patients where there is an alternative for other patients. They can use those alternatives. Sometimes it helps hospitals make those decisions.
Okay. Dr. Woodcock, in your written testimony, you had said that the FDA sent a letter to the pharmaceutical manufacturers reminding them of their current legal obligations to report certain discontinuances to the agency and urging them to voluntarily notify the FDA of all potential disruptions of the prescription drug supply to the U.S. market, even when disclosure is not currently required by law. After you did that, you said that there's been a significant increase in the number of potential shortages reported to the FDA. So my question is it your sense that manufacturers were not complying with current law before they got that letter?
Our sense is, I think, that manufacturers were complying with current law, but the current law only has a limited universe of things that have to be reported, and we ask for voluntary reporting of a much wider universe.
So as I understand it, the agency cannot expand the reporting, cannot require more reporting without authorization from Congress. Is that right?
Not more mandatory reporting.
Without authorization from Congress, right? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. That concludes. We have one more. Sorry. Chair recognizes gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Woodcock. I know you've been here for a while and been waiting. I had to go speak on Yucca Mountain, so I had my different jobs I have to do. So I just really wanted to focus on the generic user fee act issues and the proposal to develop better science for new bioequivalency methods for locally acting drugs. So the question, I mean, it's all with trust but verify, you know. How do we know we're going to get what the promises are? So what kind of, what types of metrics do you think there'll be for Congress and American people to judge whether we're getting our best return on investment with this?
Well, similar with the user fee program, you know, there are interim goals throughout this generic drug user fee program that have been devised, and we will report on those goals, and you'll know exactly what our performance is against the goals. So there are many metrics that are put into place for performance of the program. We intend to meet those metrics, but right from the beginning, we will have to do things in the first year, and we can report on those actions.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think Congress would like to see, I think the folks who are working with you collaboratively would like to make sure that it's transparent. There's predictability. A lot of our concerns is the length of time without it. So, I mean, there is just hopes that in paying for an expedited, clear, safe system, that we're going to get what's going to be paid for.
Well, I hope you can feel some confidence because of our track record of the prescription drug user fee program, where we have exceeded or met our goals through almost the entire program.
And I just want to, I've mentioned this numerous times in various hearings, and I applaud it. I think focusing on the risk-based approach in the recent reports is right on. I mean, if we've got good actors who are good actors, and they've been good actors, and they continue to be good actors, then there may be a time to revisit, but annually we can make that determination. Where obviously when we're not inspecting, we'd much rather have inspections of facilities we haven't visited versus continually re-inspecting the good actors. So I find that positive, and I look forward to that. Utilizing predict information from companies, foreign governments, and third parties could help us, obviously, to do this risk-based system. Can you describe the importance of the risk-based approach in ensuring the safety of imported drugs?
Certainly. What we know about facilities is that if they're having problems, they may not correct them, and the problems may get worse. So we go into a plant initially, we discover problems. If we don't go and return and verify that they're on the improvement trajectory, we may be seeing a situation where the production methods may be deteriorating. And so it's very important for us to go sort of where the money is, where the risk is, and to be able to follow up on those facilities that are not, that are subpar, all right, and also to follow up more closely on those facilities that are producing riskier products, such as the sterile injectables, to make sure they're continuing to meet their obligations.
And I appreciate that. And my last question is, how can we leverage the third-party actors or foreign governments? How do you think, help me talk through how do we get a little more buy-in or can get them to understand the importance of what we're trying to do?
Of the foreign governments?
Right, or other third-party entities that may be involved.
Mm-hmm. Well, we would like to, as Mr. Beckerman said, we'd like to have better ability to exchange information with foreign countries who have inspectorates. Many countries now are developing pharmaceutical inspectorates. They go to the factories. They have information. We do get heads up from them when there are problems, but we would like to have a much better global safety net so that all the regulators are working together, and any other inspectorates that might be out there, third-party inspectorates. So we share information, and we make sure around the world that that safety net exists.
Yeah, historically, I think we've all believed that the FDA has been really the gold standard. I think the EU is because of their timeliness, is getting into a competitive arena with us. We'd like to continue to be gold standard, maybe push those values, but also a timely process so we don't lose that leverage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock.
Pardon me. Chair, thanks, gentlemen. And that concludes panel one. Chair, I'd like to thank. Do we have another one?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Didn't see you. The chair recognized gentleman from New York, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to see on the side, I know. Thank you. Dr. Woodcock, several of the witnesses in the second panel in their written testimony mentioned that the user fees included in GDUFA and BSUFA are meant to be in addition to a solid base of annually appropriated funds for the FDA. So I was pleased to see that for the fiscal year 2012, the FDA received a $50 million increase in funding over 2011, fiscal 2011 funding levels. But this was a hard-fought victory, given that the first proposal was a $285 million cut in FDA funding. So could you elaborate on why it's so important that the FDA be adequately funded, and how cuts to the FDA could impact the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's ability to meet the review timeframes and inspection standards outlined in the GDUFA and BSUFA user fee agreements?
Yes. All of the user fee programs assume that there's an appropriated base funding that we build on and that is augmented by the user fees. As I think the discussion on drug shortage has illustrated, FDA has many other jobs, and the drug center or drug program has many other jobs other than simply review. And we need, for health and safety of our population, we need to do all those activities well, and we do need resources to do them. So the generic drug user fee program that is being proposed is built upon a platform of appropriated dollars and is additive. The prescription drug user fee program has always had a trigger and is of appropriated funds, and the fees are additive that allow us to meet the goals and accomplish all the ambitious that ambitious program. And similarly for biosimilars, it will be built on an appropriated base.
Well, thank you. You mentioned the drug shortages. The largest employer in my district is Montefiore Medical Center in Bronx, New York.
Yeah.
They're, as you know, premier academic medical center with centers of excellence in cancer care,
cardiovascular services, pediatrics, transplantation, and neurosciences. And my constituents have really come to rely on them. All three of my children were born there, and they're really a treasure. When I asked them about the impact of drug shortages on Montefiore, they estimated to me that members of their staff, including pharmacists and physicians, spent more than 110 hours a week addressing issues directly related to drug shortages. So clearly this issue, dealing with this, requires a significant amount of people power and labor costs in order to track down medications. Can you describe the steps the FDA is taking to assist our hospitals like Montefiore in staying on top of current and anticipated drug shortages?
Certainly. We sent a letter out to all manufacturers reminding them of their statutory obligations and asking them to voluntarily notify us in advance of potential shortages so we can do what we do to mitigate them. We work with manufacturers to mitigate. We've even allowed drugs to be shipped with filters, with instructions to filter the drug because it had particulates, if we were sure that the filter wouldn't take out the agent as well, and we had verified that. So we do those risk mitigation efforts. We even allow importation of unapproved drugs from other countries temporarily to fill the gap for our patients. And we have a web page, and we work with the associations and with the physician community to try and figure out how to mitigate these shortages. But at the end of the day, if there's no drug there that can be had, we are all in trouble.
I agree. Let me ask you this final question, which also ties in with the drug shortage problem. I've heard from healthcare providers and patients that there is an added layer of difficulty in addressing shortages in this area because they say that the DEA limits the amount of active pharmaceutical ingredient a company can purchase and manufacture. I've also heard from parents who are frustrated who they've struggled to obtain generic forms of their children's ADHD medications in recent months. So I do recognize that the DEA has to do its part to ensure that controlled substances are not being abused, but how can DEA and FDA work together to ensure that the shortages of controlled substances, such as the ADHD medications or pain medications like fentanyl, are quickly addressed and access to these medications restored to patients with a clear need?
Yes, we work very closely with the DEA, and my understanding is that the manufacturers have received their 2012 quotas for the ADHD drugs, and we expect that situation to be ameliorated very rapidly. But we do work very closely with them we provide information to them every year that is very relevant to them setting the quotas of these various drugs, how much we expect will be needed. So we have a very close relationship.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Okay, I think that concludes panel one. Chair would like to thank Dr. Woodcock and her panel for your excellent testimony and excuse panel one and call panel two to the witness table. And while they're coming, without objection, the chair would like to enter into the record 4 documents, a statement by the American Academy of Pediatrics, one by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, another by the National Community Pharmacists Association, and one by the Biotechnology Industry Organization. And this has been shared with the minority without objection. They'll be entered into the record. All right, Chair will call panel 2 to the table and would like to thank you all for agreeing to testify before the subcommittee today, and I'd like to quickly introduce our panel. First, Ms. Heather Brascia is the CEO of Mylan, Inc. Second, Mr. David Gaw is the Vice President of Regulatory Sciences at the Generic Pharmaceutical Association, and Dr. Bill Green is the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Again, thank you all for coming. We have your prepared statements. which will be entered in the record, and we ask you to summarize your opening statement in 5 minutes. Ms. Bresch, we'll begin with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Pitts and Ranking Member Pallone and members of the subcommittee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Heather Bresch, CEO of Mylan, Inc., the largest global generics company in the world, headquartered in the United States. Mylan was founded 50 years ago in West Virginia, and for the first 45 years of our history, Mylan was a domestic company that served the U.S. market. In 2007, we transformed into a global company. Today, we provide products in more than 150 countries, have a global workforce of more than 18,000, including more than 5,000 employees in the United States. Our largest drug manufacturing facility is located in Morgantown, West Virginia, where we produce nearly 20 billion doses of medicine each year. We also have multiple facilities outside of the U.S. that produce drugs that are distributed in this country and which are inspected by the FDA. Today, 1 out of every 11 prescriptions dispensed in the United States is a Mylan product. In light of our success in the global market, Mylan is adding manufacturing jobs around the globe, and we would like to not only maintain what we already have here in the United States, but we would also like to expand our U.S. presence. As we transformed from a domestic to a global company, we were surprised to discover that FDA is still operating as a domestic agency and is not equipped with the resources or legal authority to regulate the now global drug industry that serves the United States. In fact, FDA is governed by a 1938 law, which has been largely unchanged since its initial passage, and does not give FDA the full authority it needs to oversee the global industry. Unfortunately, the 1938 law also creates an unlevel playing field for American manufacturers by requiring U.S. manufacturers to be inspected every 2 years, while the law is silent on foreign drug manufacturers. As a result, 2 standards are created, one for the United States manufacturers and one for foreign. U.S. manufacturers actually have a perverse incentive to move existing U.S. jobs abroad, where they will face less regulatory scrutiny and also can avoid the second highest combined federal-state corporate tax rate of 39%. As the Pew Health Group reported to this subcommittee last week, complying with quality systems and FDA regulations represents approximately 25% of a drug manufacturer's operating cost. This disparity in standards raises very real and profound questions about the integrity and quality of the drug supply in the U.S. Clearly, every consumer should have the peace of mind of knowing that every drug product dispensed in the U.S. is held to the same standard of quality, regardless of whether the product originated in the United States or outside of its borders. Over the last several years, the number of foreign facilities supplying the U.S. has grown by 185%, while at the same time, FDA inspection rates have decreased by nearly 57%, according to the FDA. FDA estimates that up to 40% of drugs now consumed by U.S. patients are manufactured abroad, and 80% of the active ingredients used in drugs come from foreign countries. The growth in the number of foreign facilities, coupled with a significant increase in generic drug application, has caused FDA's workload to be far outpaced by its resources, and as a result, the time it takes to get a generic drug approved has nearly doubled, with more than 2,700 generic applications awaiting approval from FDA today. Now more than ever, Americans need more timely access to more affordable generic medicine, which have saved patients and the government more than $930 billion in the last decade alone. With a 50-year history of working closely with Congress and the FDA, Mylan is pleased that the generic industry has stepped up first and addressed an industry-wide issue impacting brand and generics to help address FDA's challenge of carrying out its mission within a global industry, especially given the current scarcity of government resources. The landmark and novel user fee program is aimed at 3 critical components: safety, access, and transparency. Through GDUFA, FDA will receive approximately $1.5 billion in new funding over the next 5 years, and in return, FDA has agreed to more timely reviews of generic drug applications, increased transparency, and biennial good manufacturing practice surveillance inspections of all generic finished dosage form and active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers, foreign and domestic, on a risk-adjusted basis, among other benefits outlined in a negotiated goals letter. Strengthening the supply chain, a key aim of GDUFA through routine GMP inspections for all facilities, as well as transparency initiatives that require the identification and registration of facilities involved in the supply chain, will also provide a more holistic solution to current drug shortages. Additionally, decreased review times will ensure more timely access to new generic products, including those that address an unmet medical need or those in short supply. While the generic industry and API industries will help provide the financial resources to globalize the FDA, it is imperative for Congress to update the 1938 law to ensure the integrity of the supply chain and a level playing field so companies like Mylan are not disadvantaged to grow American manufacturing jobs. A level playing field will also benefit foreign facilities as well as small and first-time entrants who are currently disadvantaged by delays in new product approvals because of a lack of a recent inspection. We urge Congress to adopt GDUFA as negotiated and move forward in updating the 1938 law. Only by taking these steps can we provide more timely access to more affordable generics, ensure competitiveness by leveling the playing field for American manufacturers, and equip FDA with the authority it needs to become a global agency to ensure the integrity of the global drug supply chain. Thank you, and I would be happy to address any questions of the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Gaw, you're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on these very timely and important issues. I'm David Goff, Vice President for Regulatory Sciences at the Generic Pharmaceutical Association and a licensed pharmacist. GPHA represents the manufacturers and distributors of finished dose generic pharmaceuticals, bulk pharmaceutical chemicals, and suppliers to the generic industry. Generic pharmaceuticals fill 78% of all prescriptions dispensed in the United States, but consume just 25% of the spend for prescription medicines. I'd like to begin by commending the committee for your continued focus on these most important issues that you're examining today. Though I've just begun my time with GPHA, I've been working in and around the generic industry for more than 2 decades and have witnessed firsthand the industry's remarkable growth and the vital role it plays in the lives of the Americans every day. This growth of the generic industry has also served to underscore the critical importance and the role of the Food and Drug Administration. As shown by these 2 historic user fee agreements and our continued efforts to address drug shortages, the level of cooperation between the industry and the FDA has never been greater. It's our hope this collaboration will continue and even extend throughout the interactions for future activities with the agencies. However, the agency remains underfunded, and the responsibilities of ensuring safe and effective access for affordable medications is shared with the entire pharmaceutical industry, not just with the FDA. This is why the generic industry has stepped up to the plate. Let me please provide some examples. Currently, well more than 2,000 generic drug applications are awaiting approval for the FDA Office of Generic Drugs, and the average approval time for these applications is now stretched to 32 months. Unfortunately, the backlog keeps growing for these generic drugs, keeps off-market competitors, and prevents the prices from continuing to go down further. The proposed generic drug user fee, or GDUFA, that we are discussing today will provide the FDA with nearly $1.5 billion over the next 5 years to help alleviate this backlog and expedite consumers to new generic drugs. It will also take the historic step of holding all players contributing to the U.S. generic drug system, both foreign and domestic, to the same inspection standards and enhance FDA's ability to identify and require the registration of active pharmaceutical ingredients and finished dosage form manufacturers involved in the production of the products being sold in the U.S. It is paramount that as we work and shape the future of our country's generic industry, we also work with the FDA to bring them into the 21st century and ensure that the agency's authority to achieve its mission and the goals are kept up to date. This is exemplified by the user fee program we are discussing today, both GDUFA and the biosimilar fee per structure. During the biosimilar fee negotiations, GPHA expressed its support for user fee funding to provide FDA with adequate resources to apply consistent regulatory standards to all biologics. Both industry and patients will benefit from this user fee program by gaining a higher degree of certainty in the timeliness of the applications, their review, and their approval. It is important to emphasize that the funding provided by these user fee programs is in addition to and not a substitute for congressional appropriations. And while the program provide an excellent framework for the industry to help support the growing global needs of the FDA, they do not completely solve the problems. For example, some manufacturers are using the REMS program as a way to delay generic competition. For products that require a full REMS and distribution in accordance with restricted systems, brand manufacturers are making it difficult for the generic manufacturers to acquire samples of products so that they can actually run the tests on the products to be able to produce the exact bioequivalent product in a generic form. GPHA also supports the adoption of a federal drug tracking system with uniform standards across all states to prevent patchwork by state law. Now let me address the drug shortage crisis. The generic pharmaceutical industry has spearheaded the development of an unprecedented multi-stakeholder collaboration, which we believe will accelerate the recovery of certain critical drugs in short supply that are in patient need. This private sector solution, which we have labeled as the Accelerated Recovery Initiative, is designed to provide a more accurate, timely, and comprehensive view of the critical drugs in drug shortage, provide greater visibility to potential shortages of those critical drugs that are established for potential loss, and voluntary production adjustments to lessen and even eliminate certain current drug shortages. This initiative is predicated on voluntary communication between an independent third party and all key stakeholders involved in the approval, the manufacturing, and the distribution of drugs that are in shortage. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, it is our hope that Congress will act on these historic user fee proposals as an expeditious process. Nothing is more important to our industry than ensuring patients have access to life-saving generic medications they require, and with a joint effort among all involved, we believe we can continue to make significant steps towards accomplishing this goal. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and now recognize Dr. Green for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement.
Chairman Pitts and other members of the committee, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address you today as a representative of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital and also a representative of colleagues at children's hospitals throughout the United States. As you know, I'm Chief Pharmaceutical Officer at St. Jude, and at St. Jude we're committed to developing research that leads to new cures for children with catastrophic diseases. We're also committed to providing unsurpassed clinical care for those patients. I'm really grateful that you would offer me time to share some comments. In my short testimony, if we can have some slides here, I'd like to share 3 ways Congress can help alleviate drug shortages for the pediatric community. But at first, I would like to begin by putting a face to my discussion, and it doesn't look like the face will be able to be displayed. I can tell the story of Lucy, who's a 5-year-old from Covington, Tennessee. Lucy and her family have given me permission to share her story as a way of describing or illustrating the challenges that drug shortages pose for patient care and for the caregivers that are providing that care. She's being treated for medulloblastoma, which is a type of brain cancer. She's been doing well. And last spring, she was being treated in her prescribed course of treatment and was being supported by intravenous nutritional support. She began to develop symptoms, rapid eye movements, blurred vision, other visual changes, some gait changes, that caused her care team to suspect that her cancer was relapsing, so she was admitted to the hospital and worked up. Fortunately, during that time, she was treated with intravenous thiamine. She experienced a dramatic recovery and was able to continue with her treatment course. The interesting background on this issue is that the cause of the thiamine deficiency was very simple. We were simply unable to secure intravenous preparations of multivitamins to add to her intravenous nutrition support. That caused the thiamine deficiency. The thiamine deficiency caused the symptoms. The symptoms resulted in a hospital admission. This was a preventable admission, and it should not have happened. You're aware that the number of drug shortages occurring in the United States has increased dramatically in recent years. While not all of these shortages have directly affected St. Jude, the number of shortages affecting us have increased dramatically. If I were able to show my second slide, I would be able to illustrate to you that we've experienced a 10-fold increase in the number of shortages requiring action at our organization since 2008. In the last 2 months alone, January and December, I've had to issue communications to our clinical staff on 14 separate occasions. Now, once that requires my action, those are important drug shortages that impact patient care, 14 times in the last 2 months. Our drug shortages threaten our nation's healthcare system, and especially children, in 3 distinct ways. First, we know that we cannot always provide the best care for these patients. Second, we know that shortages do affect research that cause modifications to protocols, sometimes delays in research and terminations. We know of at least 85 children's oncology group protocols that have been affected by shortages. And third, we know that all of these shortages definitely add real cost to the system. I know the subcommittee has heard previously heard testimony of this type. Much data has been shared. Many of the comments today have been very interesting and helpful. It's now time for immediate action. I have 3 points I'd like to make about what Congress can do to help. First, I urge Congress immediately to pass legislation to give the Food and Drug Administration the tools that it needs to prevent and minimize the impact these shortages have on pediatric care and research. The FDA has been effective in minimizing the impact of shortages when appropriate communication is made to the agency. Their efforts have avoided almost 200 shortages in 2011. Congress can strengthen the reporting system by enacting H.R. 2245, Senate Bill 296, to give the FDA more complete knowledge of permanent and temporary supply chain disruptions in advance, and allowing the FDA to facilitate its communications with caregivers like me. Second, I urge Congress to give the FDA the resources and authority it needs to combat drug shortages in a proactive manner. While the FDA's efforts have been laudable, these efforts have been largely reactive. Once a shortage is evolved, we know patients are going to be affected. The agency must have what it needs to develop proactive approaches to predict and prevent shortages. And the FDA should have sophisticated systems in place, facilitating forecasting, prediction, and enabling proactive work with suppliers and purchasers to prevent shortages from ever occurring. Further, other relevant agencies such as the DEA must work closely, collaboratively with the FDA to combat these shortages. Third, Congress must ensure that in any solution it develops, pediatric protections are built in and pediatric experts are broadly engaged. Children require medications in special strengths, packaged in smaller dose sizes, dye-free and preservative-free when possible. Hospitalized children frequently require intravenous medications, and in many cases, fewer alternatives exist for them when a drug is in short supply. For these reasons, the expertise of pediatric practitioners who are familiar with the nuances and intricacies of the care of children must be included in developing solutions for shortages. Finally, I'd like to conclude by recognizing that the underlying causes of drug shortages are complex. Solutions offered today will not solve the many reasons drug shortages exist and continue to increase in frequency. Before enacting legislation focused on addressing these underlying factors, I urge you to carefully and comprehensively study and understand these factors and the downstream impact of any proposed solutions, with input from healthcare professionals and other stakeholders. We must return to a state that used to exist when I was a younger practitioner, a state when we had a consistent, reliable, and safe supply chain of needed pharmaceutical products. Nothing less is acceptable. Thank you for your dedication to this issue and for allowing me these few minutes to speak as a provider and caregiver representing children throughout this country who have been affected by these shortages.
Chair thanks the panel for your opening statements. We'll now go to questioning, and I'll recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Ms. Bresch, how will the generic drug user fee agreement bring predictability and efficiency to FDA's review of generic drugs?
Thank you. As I think you've heard this morning, especially through Dr. Woodcock's testimony, the need for the resources to truly globalize the FDA is of utmost importance. So, as I mentioned, the fact that the generic industry stepped up to provide those resources, the fees are split primarily in 2 buckets, about 70% going towards the inspection and fees for facilities, and about 30% for the applications. So we believe that with the goals and the metrics laid out in GDUFA, that parity, not just from a timing perspective, but also the rigor at how inspections are performed, because I can tell you, as having facilities around the world inspected by many regulatory agencies, the FDA does have the gold standard, and I think it's very important to raise the bar for the rest of the world, not let the United States bar come down.
Will this predictability and efficiency bring down the cost of generic drugs, and what are the metrics that are included in the goals letter to ensure that progress is made on the review of generic applications?
So as we've noted, the approval time today for generic drugs is about 31 months, almost double that in recent years. So the goals and metrics laid out bring that back down to about 10 months within 5 years. So it certainly keeps the competitive nature of our industry very much at the forefront, while as we level that playing field, making sure that it's not just competition at any cost. I think what's important to remember that the competition is important if everybody's held to the same standard. So the certainty comes with the reduction of approval time, but making sure that we're having good competition, not just any competition.
Mr. Gaw, why is the new biosimilars user fee program important to the generic industry and to patients, and what are the metrics included in the goals letter to ensure that progress is made in that regard?
Well, it's extremely important to the American public to have access to the biosimilar pathway of products. As you heard Dr. Woodcock say today is the first day that they've announced that they're going to release the guidelines for the biosimilars. So unfortunately, until we see those guidelines, it's going to be hard for me to answer the rest of the question, but it is extremely important to have that affordable access to the American public. And you'll find that many of the companies that GPHA represents already have these products produced and approved in foreign countries, both Europe and other markets.
Thank you. Dr. Green, talk a little bit about how drug shortages affect St. Jude and how many drugs used at your hospitals regularly go into shortage.
Thank you for that question. We deal with shortages on a continual basis. I believe Mr. Engel referred to Montefiore and the number of hours that they've dedicated to managing drug shortages. That, I believe you mentioned 100 or 120 hours per week of total personnel time. That's not a gross exaggeration in any form or fashion. As I mentioned, I'm continually engaged in interacting with my clinical staff on what are the shortages, what are the alternatives, when we have fentanyl, when we don't have fentanyl, when we have Zofran, when we don't have Zofran, when we have multivitamins, when we have mannitol, what do we do when it goes away? It has a dramatic impact, and it diverts significant resources away from actually taking care of the patients, because we're focusing on one of the most basic elements of care, and that is simply, do we have the product available for us? So it's very dramatic impact on us on a day-in, day-out basis. Some days are better than others, but some days are simply very traumatic in trying to provide that care.
Can you walk us through, Dr. Green, what happens from your perspective when there's a drug shortage? Who notifies you? How much warning do you get? What do you need to do to notify people in your organization? Is there any way at present to anticipate a shortage, and what preparations do you need to put in place at the hospital level?
You know, I made reference to in my testimony the need to support the proposed legislation that effectively builds the tools to allow for early warning types of systems. Historically, we're not aware of a drug shortage evolving until we simply place an order. We check our inventory when it comes in, and we realize after 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days, we keep getting shorted on the order. We don't know about it. Nobody tells us the shortage is there. So effectively, you place an order, you get the drug or you don't, and of course the shortage is recognized when we don't get it the day after we order it. We place another order, we're shorted, and then finally you begin to realize there's something going on here. Now, fortunately, the University of Utah Drug Information Center and American Society of Health System Pharmacists now have a very useful tool that allows organizations to become aware of the experience of other organizations, healthcare systems, that have experienced shortages, so that, for example, I might report to that system that we're having trouble getting methotrexate, and that might be the first notification that we're beginning to see problems with methotrexate in the country, and that way other organizations become aware of that. So there is no warning in too many cases, and we simply have to be reactive in dealing with those problems.
Okay, the chair thanks the gentleman, and now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Plum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask a question of Ms. Bresch first, if I could. In your testimony, you emphasized that the imbalance of inspection requirements between U.S. and foreign manufacturing facilities creates an uneven playing field for pharmaceutical plants in the U.S. And certainly one way to help level the playing field, which was mentioned by our previous panel, is to apply a risk-based system, oversight system, to all manufacturing facilities, both foreign and domestic. However, my question is, to ensure real parity for all manufacturing locations, do you think that a minimum inspection frequency is also necessary, and should that be defined in a statute that we would pass?
I believe that risk-based is appropriate, but I do believe that defining how that risk-based works is incredibly important. I mean, if I give the example, I talked about our facility in Morgantown, West Virginia. There's two full-time employees by the FDA who live in Morgantown, West Virginia, for just our facility. So if the risk base is not defined properly, our concern is that it will be easy to go to where FDA has been going, and that compliance-based will be extremely important to define that formula. So I believe that the legislation needs to have a very well-defined formula, and that there should be some minimum that a facility would need to have been inspected by.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask Mr. Goff, right?
Yes.
Goff, is it?
Goff, yes.
Goff. I'm interested in this Accelerated Recovery Initiative, or ARI. I mentioned it previously also, I think before the last panel, that you described in your testimony. It sounds like a promising effort that would help industry address or prevent shortages, and I'm interested in hearing exactly how it would interface with the FDA. Could you explain what the role of the FDA would be in that initiative, and particularly I'd like to learn what the third party would be able to do that the FDA does not do, and whether you see this initiative as potentially complementary to legislation that would mandate FDA notification, or is your hope that it would be instead of legislation?
Thank you. From the standpoint of pulling this together, as I said earlier in my verbal testimony, but also in the written testimony, this will be a multi-stakeholder event, and there are many questions that were asked of Dr. Woodcock that would be addressed by the ARI. For example, as we were talking about the gray market, and I can't remember, I think it was Mr. Cassidy that asked about how we know how much product a different organization, a hospital, can get when they order, or how much is available to them. That would mean that in this ARI, the key stakeholders would be the manufacturers, the wholesalers and distributors, the group purchasing organizations, the FDA, most importantly, and then the third party, as you mentioned, which would be an independent third party. The issues that we have addressed in the small group that's pulling the ARI together is that this is a very competitive marketplace, of course, and it would be fraught with some FTC potential issues if not handled in appropriate fashion. So the appropriate fashion that we've come up with to this point is an independent third party that would be a blinding party, if you will, so they are the only party that sees all information coming from all the competitive companies. To answer your question about why the FDA couldn't perform this, there are multiple reasons. One, it isn't currently in their responsibility of duties as you see the responsibilities. Number two, Dr. Woodcock talked about the limited resources they currently have, which is very true. The drug shortage was only 4 or 5 people up until a few months ago. It's now been doubled, I believe, to 7 or 8 people. So that would be a limiting factor. The other piece is the third party is going to have to be somebody who really understands production planning extremely well and can take production planning reports from the multiple different companies to make determinations and decisions on who could or who could not produce products to help alleviate this drug shortage. That's not something that currently exists within the expertise.
Well, it sounds
FDA.
to me, I'm just because I'm running out of time. It sounds to me that in terms of the question I asked, that you're saying that the initiative, the ARA, is complementary to legislation that we would initiate. In other words, not that it would be instead of, but this, because of the need to work together and certain things that can't be done, this would be something that we'd have to work out in terms of the legislation. Is that accurate?
That is correct. That's accurate.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goff, if we could stay with you for a moment, and let me just ask you, and I know this is a wide-ranging question, so I'm going to ask you to be as brief as you can, but what are, in your opinion, what are the reasons that a drug goes into shortage?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
What are the reasons that a drug goes into shortage?
Dr. Woodcock described the overall situation with drug shortage, so it really is a demand versus supply situation right now. So the demand continues to increase in the United States with the graying of America, et cetera. So demand continues to go up. The available supply, currently available supply, is going down. So if you look at, as she talked, in the injectable industry in particular, there is a defined quantity of production capability in the U.S. Currently, most of the companies that are under the production capability piece are in remediation efforts due to their compliance or their lack of compliance situation. So the available capacity today is less than it was about a year and a half ago.
But here's the thing. The manufacturing processes in many of these drugs are not new. They've been around for a long time. The FDA's been doing inspections for years. The companies have had to get the raw materials for years, and they've been making injectables for years. So why the acceleration in the last 5 years?
If you look at the basic five companies, we're still just talking about sterile generic injectables, the basic five companies that have the majority of the production capability. These are aged facilities. So as the manufacturing lines are becoming older, they need to be replaced, refurbished, upgraded. Specifically also the specifications, the criteria that need to be met are changing year after year. Those have to be implemented. Sterile production, sterile injectable production is a very complex process. It takes time to upgrade those systems. And when you do upgrade them, you have to take them down for a period of time.
Right. But don't you find it?
I'm sorry?
Don't you find it odd that that it really has been a snowball effect? I can remember in the 2004 presidential election, in one of the debates that fall, flu vaccine had been contaminated with serratia. We got it from an overseas source, and President Bush was just pummeled for this flu vaccine shortage. And now the shortages are happening all the time, and that level of scrutiny doesn't seem to be being applied to the fact that more and more drugs are drifting off into a shortage situation. Why is that?
Because I would say the level of scrutiny that is upon those companies by the FDA has increased over the last 3 to 4 years, and that level of scrutiny is what's
But the shortages are going to be manifest by the clinicians not having the compound to deliver to their patients, not the Food and Drug Administration saying, aha, we've identified a shortage in your line. It's because at the end of the line, the doctor and the patient are saying, I can't get this stuff. So I would just, let me ask you this. There's some new branded drugs that are complex molecules, difficult to manufacture, and there are 10 to 15 generic oncology drugs that have been around forever and are quite basic in their formulation. And those are the ones that are in shortage, not the complex new molecules. So why is it that the complex branded drugs are readily available and the basic generic drugs are in short supply?
Typically, the complex brand molecules you're talking about are manufactured in one facility, one line for that particular product. If you look at the generic injectables, those companies produce anywhere from 50 to 120 different molecules on their different lines. So it's a supply and demand issue, again, within that facility of the number of products that are made.
As I brought this up in my opening statement, do you think there is the possibility that we have perhaps made things a little too tight, made the margins a little too tight, where it's difficult for companies to justify continue manufacture if they have a difficulty in their manufacturing process, or for other companies to step in and fill the gap if a company has to withdraw from the manufacturing?
And by
We just don't have the profit margins built in under the current constraints.
Profit margin could be one of the causative effects, but it's not one of the major causative effects, no.
Okay.
It is still a demanding market in the U.S., and you can change the price as needed.
Very well. Dr. Green, let me just ask you a question. You heard Dr. Cassidy on our side. You heard Lois Capps on the other side of the dais reference what they suspect was a problem in the gray market, where some hospitals might be buying up a compound that is going into shortage and then reselling it at a much higher markup. Is that something that you've experienced? I mean, Dr. Cassidy asked some specific questions. You deal in hospital purchasing all the time. Was he on the mark there, or was that off?
Someone certainly is getting product somewhere, and maybe that's an entrepreneurial way, but they're taking advantage of shortages to make dramatic markups. Now, how they get the product, I don't know. I would be very, very surprised if any hospital is actually purchasing it for the purpose of diverting it to the gray market. But it would be very, we know that it happens, we just don't know where these individuals get their drug. And that's one of the reasons why St. Jude, we do not purchase off of the gray market.
Well, where would be a more likely place to look then if it's not the hospital purchasing?
I wish I could explain that. I don't know. I know that there are thefts. There are reports of tractor-trailer loads of drugs that have been simply stolen, and you don't ever know where those go and how they get into the marketplace. And so I do not know where those drugs come from. Again,
you agree that it's a problem?
I don't know that it contributes dramatically to shortages. I think it's a problem in the context that it provides potentially very expensive and potentially harmful products for use in patients.
All right, thank you for your time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman and yields to the ranking member emeritus, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. These questions go to Ms. Bresch. First, I want to welcome you to the committee. Thank you. I want to thank you for your leadership in this matter and tell you how much it has meant to me. These questions will be all yes or no. Do you agree that both FDA and the industry have a responsibility to ensure the security of our drug supply chain? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you agree that the knowledge of your suppliers is important? Yes or no?
Yes.
Does Mylan have systems in place to know their suppliers and monitor manufacturing quality? Yes or no?
Yes.
It would be nice if you had more assistance in this, however, from FDA, would it not?
Yes.
Does Mylan have systems in place to demonstrate quality control? Yes or no?
Yes.
Should all companies making drugs for the United States know their suppliers and have quality systems in place?
Yes.
Should all companies making drugs for the U.S. be able to demonstrate quality control? Yes or no?
Yes.
Should companies be using a risk analysis to target safety risks? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you need to have the same kind of attention given to the supplies and the commodities and the other things that go into the pharmaceuticals that you sell as finished products?
Yes.
Do you agree that strong quality management systems and risk analysis will help companies to ensure the safety and quality of the finished drug product?
Yes.
I want to turn now to inspections. The brand industry has noted that its user fees go to pay for a pre-approval inspection, which could include an inspection at a foreign facility. Is pre-approval inspection the same as a GMP inspection? Yes or no?
No.
Please explain the difference.
The way PDUFA was written and is implemented is really focused on the speed for an individual product. So a pre-approval inspection is on a certain product which could be made on one line in a facility, and once that product's approved, it would never require the FDA to come back and inspect that line. GMP inspection covers the entire facility and ensures that that facility is complying to good manufacturing practices.
And you do desperately need Food and Drug to come back. For that purpose, to assure that good manufacturing practices are being carried out at the plant being inspected. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think, as we've heard a lot today, the vigilance that's required is on an ongoing basis. Just because you meet GMP inspection or GMP compliant, that does not mean you're GMP compliant for the rest of that facility's life. So the need, and that's why earlier when asked about a risk-based approach to inspections, and that we still believe that there would be a minimum number of years that the FDA would need to be back in that facility because it requires ongoing constant vigilance.
Now, you stated in your testimony that the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act should be updated to require parity of inspections for domestic and foreign facilities. Why does Congress need to change the statutory language when FDA has already agreed to do on a voluntary basis in the Generic Drug User Fee Act?
Well, I think, as many of you, and I want to thank you for your leadership in this area for many years, I think to have an agency as important as the FDA to be governed by a 1938 law that was written from a very domestic standpoint, and yet we are needing and demanding the FDA to govern a global industry. So if we're not going to have the global industry return to a domestic one, we have no choice but to have the 1938 law be representative of the world that the FDA needs to operate in today. I think we heard Dr. Woodcock speak about the fact that there's just a different standard. If a product's manufactured in the United States, it's assumed to be adulterated unless proven that it's been made to GMP. Yet if we're importing drugs, the standard that we hold those imports to, we have to show and prove that they're not up to GMP, or we have to let them in. So I believe that 1938 law desperately needs to be updated so that the FDA has all the ability to make all the decisions and necessary demands to ensure this the safety of and the supply chain integrity on a global basis.
Now, it also is grossly unfair to surround American manufacturers with all of these requirements, while literally FDA is able to surround foreign manufacturers with virtually none. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. Again, we talk about the competitive nature of this industry. So we're forced to compete really at any cost. So we are competing every day from competition and companies around the globe that perhaps don't hold their facility to the same standard as we do. We have facilities all over the world, as I mentioned, that make product for the United States, and we hold all of our companies to the same GMP, whether that facility is in the United States or outside of the United States. So the need for the competitiveness as a U.S. manufacturer is very unlevel at the moment. And unfortunately, as a manufacturer who employs many American jobs, like I said, we would like to not only maintain those, but to increase them. And right now, we're disincentivized to do so.
Mr. Chairman, I have used all my time, but could I have one more question?
You may proceed.
Ma'am, the Generic Drug User Fee Act agreement is unique in that it recognizes that FDA needs new resources and new authorities to properly oversee what is now a globalized industry, as you have been pointing out to us. I happen to believe that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act should and needs to be updated to reflect the global nature of our drug supply, again, as you were pointing out, and to adequately equip FDA with the authority to properly ensure the safety of our drug supply, and that would include the commodities that go in an unfinished state. This committee has worked in a bipartisan manner to secure the safety of consumer products in our food supply, and I hope that we can do so for pharmaceuticals. I want to commend you for what it is you have done today and for your guidance and counsel in these matters. It has been most helpful, and you go with my thanks, and I think the thanks of the committee. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your courtesy.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I do appreciate the panel and your time today. Ms. Brush, you're from West Virginia, is that correct? I mean, the facility is in West Virginia, is that what you said?
That's where our largest facility is. We have facilities all over the United States,
okay,
Illinois
I just want to talk. Do you know how many drug manufacturing facilities are in the state of Virginia? I mean, West Virginia?
I don't know of any other.
At the West Virginia facility, there's 2 FDA inspectors 24/7,
They live in Morgantown, yes.
and they are dedicated solely to your facility?
I can't speak to what they're dedicated to, but I can tell you that they live in Morgantown, West Virginia, and like I said, we're the only pharmaceutical company.
I mean, do
that
they come
know.
in every day to your facility?
They're not necessarily in our facility every day, so that's why I'm saying I'm sure the FDA can utilize them in other manners. My point just being that we have countries that don't have an FDA employee, so when you think about Morgantown having 2, it can just demonstrates the unlevel playing field.
Yeah, I'd like to have 2 in China, maybe.
Or maybe 200, but yes.
Yeah, at least 2 would be a start. You know,
Exactly.
But I think that raises the issue, and I do appreciate your comments. I've been focused on this risk-based system for a long time, and it's not to walk away from U.S. facilities, but it is to recognize the fact that, as Chairman Emeritus Dingell said, I mean, you've had an inspector on site, you've got programs and plans and systems to obviously check that yourself. We also have a pretty good litigious environment that also keeps U.S. manufacturing facilities somewhat cognizant of the safety and efficacy of what they're doing in the facility. So I think there would be, if we did aggressively move in a risk-based approach, there'd be a return. It's not like they're never going to come back to Morgantown, West Virginia and check in on you.
And we want them to. And I think that's the point of the vigilance that I spoke about. It's that need. We say all the time, there's good actors out there and bad actors everywhere, United States included. It's just the rigor that the FDA has to inspect the U.S. We find those quicker or perhaps never in some other countries.
Thank you. Dr. Green, I apologize for you not getting your charts and stuff up on the overhead because we were able to pull it from your testimony. And this is pretty stark. I mean, I would guess you're pretty concerned that the trend line's not changing anytime soon. Is that correct?
It doesn't portend good things for the future if it continues in the same direction.
And that, I mean, that, so when from the other members in this discussion, I think it seems like we kind of mealy-mouth around trying to really identify the problem. We talked about this in the last hearing, and I was just asking a basic question. Why? Because I'm a conservative, competitive market corporate Republican, believer in the supply and demand principles. Why is that not working here? Why isn't there a signal being sent to manufacturers, hey, there is a demand that's not being filled. Can you not send a price signal that would then generate an interest, especially as Dr. Burgess said, some of this stuff isn't really the high-tech type stuff. I mean, when the mention of saline solution with vitamins inside of it, you're thinking, he's telling me, yeah, that stuff we do all the time. For that to be a limited availability, that's crazy talk.
Yeah, I am not qualified to really comment on whether the economics are dramatically a part of this or not. I would leave that to the economists. It would seem to me that...
Well, let me ask anyone else can talk. I mean, part of hearings is trying to find an answer. So go ahead, Mr. Goff.
So economics can be a piece of it, absolutely, but are they the driving factor? They are not the driving
Okay,
factor.
when you say the economics could be, so drill down a little bit.
So in drilling down a little bit, the economics, yes, if a product in the competitive market space went down so far that there was no more margin, you would make a decision potentially to get out of that market. But this is a free market environment, and you can raise that price back up and get
that's what I've assumed, but it doesn't seem that the market signals are being sent when there's a limit that the price is going up to encourage people to enter the market.
Right, and the issue we're talking about now is sterile generic injectables. When you look at that line on the graph that you have, the majority of those, it's purely as a capacity limitation to be able to produce those products. So
so the market signal would send, if they can get a return on investment, it would send a signal to the manufacturers, expand to meet the demand. But the signal's not being sent.
It is being sent, but expand is a 7-year proposition, typically, from the day
And,
you...
okay, but why is that?
The day you break ground until you are approved by the
Rules,
FDA.
regulations, citing, permitting, all this other junk?
The FDA approval is an 18-month
there's okay.
process, and that's just to get the site approved, and then to move the products into that site is an additional...
Yeah. Well, and that's great, and my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it, but I think that's where some of this debate needs to be. How do we move aggressively, safely, to allow expansion to meet these shortages? Because this is ridiculous, and we shouldn't put up with it. And I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goff, I want to follow up on something that Dr. Burgess mentioned before. In your written testimony, you stated that your trade association acknowledged that roughly half of all reported shortages are associated with manufacturing problems. Why do you believe that there's been such a significant increase in manufacturing-related issues in recent years? And can you please elaborate on what steps the manufacturers of generic medications are taking to address this problem? Obviously, we cannot neglect patient safety, and so it's a matter of great concern.
So if I understand your question correctly, is it you look at the environment today, and again, I'm going to focus on the sterile generic injectables, roughly 25 to 30% of the currently available capacity is not available for production due to remediation efforts. So if you take that 30% roughly out of production, that's what's causing the majority, that's the majority cause of these drug shortage situations.
All right, thank you. Dr. Green, you had commented on a comment I had made involving Montefiore Medical Center having to take hours to make sure that the things are ameliorated. I want to give you a chance to elaborate on that a little more.
Specific to St. Jude, I presume. Yeah, the efforts one of the things we've simply developed as a standard practice every week is one of the questions we do in our routine administrative discussion is what is our latest state of drug supply issues? What are they? What's their acuity? Do we move them out into the clinical discussion realm, or is this one that we work within the pharmacy? I have literally 3 individuals that are routinely engaged in the discussion and evaluation and follow up to me every day. That's not all that they do, but they spend a significant amount of their time dealing with these issues. And part of the problem from my point of view is the volatility in the supply. I have fentanyl today. No, I don't have fentanyl tomorrow. It's back. I only have large volume vials. I don't have small volume. Oh, well, I've got single dose vials this week, but I don't have the vials that I need to use to make PCAs. So those are the kinds of issues that we're dealing with at any given time.
Thank you. I mentioned to Dr. Woodcock, I'd asked her this question, that many of you mentioned in your written testimony that the user fees included in GDUFA and PSUFA are meant to be in addition to a solid base of annually appropriated funds to the FDA. In fiscal year 2012, the FDA received a $50 million increase in funding, which was a very big victory for those of us who felt it happened, because the first proposal was a $285 million cut in FDA funding for fiscal year 2012. So would any of you care to elaborate on why it's so important that the FDA be adequately funded, and how cuts to the FDA could impact your industry or the patients your associations serve?
Maybe I'll speak to that. I think that as Dr. Woodcock mentioned, the premise has always been the FDA would have the appropriations, and that they would never solely rely on user fees for any particular industry. And that's why I think, as you see the GDUFA being a very novel and landmark user fee, the agency has obviously funded the Office of Generic Drugs since 1984 and has been very successful. Hopefully the user fee is now complementing that. I think that when you look at the need for the generic biologics program, the same does not hold true. And I think that's where we run some risk of having it being way too weighted on strictly user fees and not having the appropriate appropriations from the agency perspective to carry out their mission.
Thank you. I agree with you. Anybody else care to address it? Okay, well, then thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes for questions.
If I seem in a hurry, I'm missing a lunch with the greatest chefs in Louisiana. So, oh my gosh, I'm tasting the food. Now, Mr. Gall, you mentioned though that there is no reason a price signal could not be sent, but there actually are constraints on how 340B will allow a company to raise its pricing. So, and you will know more about 340B than I, but I am struck that this price signal Shimkus is after is dampened by the 340B process. Now, Dr. Green, you're at St. Jude's?
That is correct.
Now, I think I know, but correct me if I'm wrong, that pediatric IV immunoglobulin was, because of a shortage, was taken out of the 340B program. What has happened? One, is that correct? And two, if correct, how has that affected supply?
Well, it is my understanding that that is correct, that we have not, to my knowledge, in the time that we've been engaged in the 340B program, it's only been about a year and a half now, I suppose, not quite that long. I don't think we've ever been able to purchase any consistent supplies of IVIG in the 340B program, and yes, so I would say that that is true. The supply's been available to us. It's just that we've had to pay the regular market rate defined through our group purchasing organization.
Now, so that's interesting. So, and again, I think IVIG was taken off of 340B pricing. I think that's true. So now the supply is there, and it was absolutely taken off because it was never available before. I think I know that, but I'm a little rusty in my thought. Mr. Gall, you're nodding your head yes. Is that a correct?
That is correct. Yes.
I remember that correctly. Now, so if you will, the restoration of a price signal restored supply. I'll just point that out. Now, Dr. Green, you also mentioned St. Jude's. Everybody knows St. Jude's. That you've had a hard time, and times in your testimony you said you could not get chemotherapeutic agents. But y'all are big, so I presume you obtained them someplace. I have this kind of interest in the gray market. Do you get them from other hospitals? Do you buy them from third parties? Do you go into the gray market? Not asking you to indict yourself, but I'm trying to understand, what do companies do when they can't get this drug?
I can think of two specific examples in the last year. One was Ceterabine, which in fact got to be, we use a lot of that for treatment of our ALL patients, and it got to the point where we had to consider seriously whether we could accept new patients for treatment of ALL.
But how did you, and we have limited time, so if you can cut to the chase, how did you supplement your supply?
Well, we were diligent first on the marketplace to try to find any source, but also communicated with colleagues at other organizations. I had other hospitals in the region
Did you ever
that
go in the
shared
gray
supply.
market?
Oh, no. We do not buy from the gray market.
Okay. Now, any one of you, Ms. Bresch, I'm struck when I asked in a previous time, why don't you just backtrack? Okay, here's a hospital that buys on the gray market. Why don't you just take this all the way back and find out where the source of the gray market was? Because different hearing, but same topic. Well, we don't know where it's coming from. I'm thinking, well, you don't know where it's coming from. Why don't you just call up Hospital X and say, who'd you buy it from? Now, you're on this end, not that end, but how would you comment upon how we are tracking drug?
I think you perhaps just answered your question. We don't track drug, and the FDA does not track drugs. And in fact, one of the premises of GDUFA, the generic industry proposal, was the fact that this has led to a very weak supply chain. So I know there's been a lot of discussion today on drug shortages about, is there a price point, what's really the cause of it, and I would contend that one of the issues that we're seeing as a result is this very weak supply chain we have today. So not only do we not track, I mean, I believe the FDA would tell you they have no idea where some products are manufactured throughout the world. They have no even idea where the facility is.
So when people buy online from overseas pharmacies, we have no clue whether that pharmacy is doing GMP, the manufacturers, or even whether it's counterfeit drug, correct?
You don't have any idea if you walk into your corner pharmacy here in Washington, D.C. You don't even have to go online. Today, you have no idea where the product you're buying comes from.
My jaw drops.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why serialization, which has been a topic, I know of some other hearings, and the need for us to be able to track and trace. We highly agree that that needs to happen.
Now let me stop just because we have 18 seconds left before I return to my Louisiana seafood. How would you all define the gray market? I'm just curious, what's a working definition in your mind?
Entrepreneurial America is how I would define it.
So you wouldn't see a problem with it, or you would just say that...
I do see a problem with it, absolutely, but it's not illegal that we're aware of. It's a brokerage firm, if you will, so it's people who...
So it's not a black market in the sense that it is legal. On the other hand, it is a gray market created by price distortions and shortages. Would you agree with that, Dr. Green?
Would, and there is no pedigree that runs through the gray market process, and that's why you can't trace it back to the gray market.
Okay.
You can trace it to a certain level, but not completely, because the pedigree doesn't exist in a gray market environment.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back. I'm over.
Chair thanks you, gentlemen, and now recognize the gentlelady from Colorado.
Thank you
Ms.
very
Degat,
much,
for 5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman. And thank you for the comity that you've given to allow me to question as a member of the full committee. Dr. Green, I wanted to ask you what would you be able to do with these patients if you were informed in a timely fashion of an impending drug shortage?
Well, of course, it would depend upon the severity of the shortage and what details would come out of that. But the first step we would assess is the number of patients that would be dependent upon that drug, the number of patients affected, the alternatives that we would have to consider, and their relative risk-benefit compared to the first drug of choice that we would want to
Let me ask you this, because you said that you were supporting House Bill 2245, which gratified me because I'm the prime sponsor of that bill.
We're grateful for that, too.
Along with Congressman Rooney. It's a bipartisan bill that has Democratic and Republican co-sponsors. So what that does is it basically expands the current FDA voluntary reporting program and makes it mandatory. How would that help? How would that help you be able to do your job better in treating these patients?
In short, it would alert us to situations that we could do something about before it reached us. We could modify our dosing approaches. We could take additional steps to minimize waste. There are sometimes alternatives depending on the drug that we could easily switch to before we deplete our on-hand supply. There are a number of on-hand things we could do.
Now, you would agree with all of us that this legislation and just doing reporting, that doesn't solve the underlying problems. It just mainly helps you deal with that chart that some folks were showing where you have these terrible shortages and it impacts patient treatment, right?
That is correct.
Now, Ms. Bresch, I'm going to assume you don't like the idea of drug shortages either, do you?
No.
and I would assume, Mr. Gall, you don't like them either, right?
Do not.
And I know, Ms. Bresch, your company right now, in fact, participates in the voluntary FDA reporting program right now. You've got four drugs, largely injectables, that are right now on the shortage list, right?
But to my knowledge, our shortage is because we've helped fill the capacity because
Right.
of other
No, I'm just
manufacturers.
saying you participated in that
absolutely,
program,
coordinated.
right? And it's worked for you, right?
Yes, for years.
And for years. And what you're suggesting, I think, is really important, which is if we modified some of the other underlying laws that have been on the books for decades and decades, that might help solve the underlying problem of drug shortages, right?
Absolutely. I believe strengthening the supply chain will
Right.
go a long way.
Right, and expediting the approval process and everything else, right? And Mr. Gall, you're nodding too. You think so too,
Yes,
right?
I would agree.
But trying to start fixing the underlying problems, even if we pass legislation right away, which I would support doing that, that's not going to solve the drug shortage issues that Dr. Green and all the other hospitals are dealing with right now, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. And so I know, Mr. Gall, your association has proposed this accelerated recovery initiative, which would be a voluntary collaboration for the industry to work on some reporting issues, correct?
Yes.
And you're not moving forward with that until you make sure that the FTC has addressed your antitrust issues, right?
We're moving forward in a parallel path, if you will.
Right,
yes.
but if there's antitrust issues, you're going to have to address those. Now, that particular program is not, it's not either or with the FDA reporting program, right? You could have both the industry program and the FDA program, right?
Yes, and it would be in supportive of. We've already presented to the FDA, and they're in agreement in concept with the process.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm in agreement with the concept too. I like the concept of having industry having a reporting process, but also having the FDA have a reporting process. Now, has your association taken a position on House Bill 2245? That's the legislation I talked about.
Notification process. We agree with notification. It's the details that would be in that. And
have you looked at my bill?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yes.
And what is your position on my bill?
As well.
Sorry?
And have spoken with your staffers as well. Yes.
I heard that rumor. and what is your position on my bill?
We support the communication process as far as industry communicating to the FDA when drug shortages are known. The devil, as I said, is in the details.
What details do you have a concern about?
The mandatory timing of those, so you know the 6-month or the 1-year notification process, as long as we are aware of that, is appropriate. But in many cases, we're not aware.
So it's just some technical language that you think we could work on. We look forward to working with you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Chair, thanks, panel 2, for your testimony. Excellent information. That concludes our second panel, and I would like to thank all of the witnesses and members for participating in today's hearing, and remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond promptly to the questions. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on Friday, February the 24th. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.